so we're going to talk about protection tonight, right? Real men protect folks. And, Sean gave a really good message that kind of dovetails in. If you look at the numbers, usually, other than presidential elections in the state of Washington, only about 60% of folks vote, right? So to me, that's us abdicating our responsibility, abdicating our authority, abdicating the things that God has asked us to do. I mean, you can have 1,000 different folks give you an opinion on, where God and Christ and politics line up. Okay, listen to 1,000 folks. But I'm going to tell you that as a citizen, everything I can find in Scripture tells us, as a citizen, we should be a part of the citizenry, right? And that includes voting. So get out, do your part, do your vote. We're not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. Sean can tell you who to vote for, but I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. But vote for whoever you think has the right godly principles. So that's really what it comes down to. If you're a Christian, you're a believer of God, you're a disciple of Christ, you should vote for the folks that Christ would vote for, right? And I'm not sure he'd go vote because he's the king. Okay. I digress. Let me get my thing open here. Sorry, I was not quite as prepared as I should have been. Okay. All right. All right. I'm ready there, sir. All right. So let's get started. Right. So when Abraham heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them. And he went and pursued as far as Dan, and he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions and also brought back his kinsman Lot and his possessions and the women and the people. All right. So hopefully everybody's had a good week. We're going to continue our series on godly men blank. And I already told you, I kind of gave it away. I get to talk about godly men protect others, right? And that's kind of like we've already alluded to. That's a big topic. We could spend weeks on it. And I'll be honest with you, I struggle with this because, God gave me a message, I think, about a month ago. I kind of hear God in the middle of the night because I don't always sleep well. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, I'll wake up and I'm like, all right, what are you going to tell me tonight? And there's always something. There's always something. And about a month ago, he gave me this nugget of a thought. And it's a beautiful message, but I had a hard time figuring out the landing. So if I crash at the end, go ahead and tell me. I'm not too proud. I'll take your feedback. But I'm going to tell you, we could spend a lot of time talking about protecting. Now, I'm not interested in the equalizer version of protection, right? You can have that, right? I'm maybe more so interested in the warrior priest version, right? The guy who understands his godly place in the world and his protective status in the world. So maybe more I'm okay with that, but I think we often get lost in the physical piece of that, right? The physical protection piece, right? And I do too. I'm on church security, so I get lost in that piece of it. It's easy to, right? But sometimes we forget about the more esoteric versions and pieces, right? So I'm going to hit a couple of high points tonight, and then we're going to talk to an example from the Bible, and we're going to do a little compare and contrast, all right? So we're going to talk through a couple areas, and then we'll get to some storytelling, which is what I like to do. I don't have any jokes. Terry didn't send me any, so I don't have any jokes for you, so I apologize for that. But we're going to cover 3 different areas, right? We're going to cover layers of protection. The protection's 4 components. And the notes say here, God are good and bad examples, but I kind of tweaked a little bit today, sorry. We're going to talk a little bit about a lot, or about Lot. So let's get started. So we're going to start with the layers of protection, as I think we should understand them, right? And these are from a book that we've been working on, and these layers of protection are level 1, God himself. Level 2, angels. Level 3 is human government, which we've already talked about a little bit tonight. Level 4, church leadership, and level 5, men. And now some of you are going to probably disagree a little bit with a few of those levels, but I'm going to tell you why they're there, right? So first off, and of course the easiest one is God himself. I mean, Scripture's full of instances of God's protection for his people, corporately and individually. 2 Thessalonians 3:3 tells us the Lord is faithful, right? He will establish you and guard you against the evil one. Psalm 46:1 from the Amplified Version tells us God is our refuge and strength, mighty and impenetrable, a very present and well-proved help in trouble. And then finally, Psalm 91:1, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will remain secure and rest in the shadow of the Almighty, whose power no enemy can withstand. I mean, we could go on and on. I mean, literally hundreds of them, right? And plus, I'm sure most of you, or many of you at least, have testimonies of God's sovereign protection in your life or the life of your friends or your family. And if you don't have that personally, I'm sure you know someone who does, right? Someone, I guarantee you, people in this room have. I mean, if you don't, come talk to me. I've got a few, right? So next we have angels, and I'm not going to go crazy on the topic, but if you believe the Word of God, the Bible, then you got to believe in angels. You just have to, right? I mean, Psalm 91:1 or 91:11 tells us, says, he will command his angels in regard to you to protect and defend and guard you in all your ways of obedience and service. I mean, even Satan quoted this to Jesus, right? So, I mean, even the devil believes in angels. So I think we should too, right? We may not want to believe in that seemingly nebulous supernatural world of angels and demons, but you better. Because I think we all know that that's where the battle's truly waged. We've talked about that a lot in Upward Men, right? And we're going to go lastly, one topic on, let's go to the book of Daniel, right? If you haven't read the book of Daniel, I would highly recommend it. And read it more than once. Read it as a study. Find a good Bible study on the book of Daniel, because, it's just amazing, right? It's an amazing book. It's full of God's grace, God's power, God's providence, and just, it's prophetic, it's historic. It's unbelievable, right? So we're going to look at one verse. And there's several chapters you can pick that talk about specifically and allude to angels and Daniel's visitation by them. But in Daniel 10:21 it says, "But I, Gabriel, an angel, will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth. There is no one who stands firmly with me and strengthens himself against these hostile spirits except Michael," another angel, "your prince, the guardian of your nation," right? So Daniel is visited by an angel and told about other angels. So, you kind of got to believe in them. All right. Third, we got human government. We've had a good talk about government today, what we're supposed to do. And you may want to disagree about that as a layer of protection in your life. But we've all read Romans 13:1, right? And it tells us, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except for God, granted by his permission and sanction, and those which exist have been put in his place by God." Right? So whether we like who's in party or who's in control or not, they're there because God, in his sovereign wisdom, has either placed them there or allowed them to be there. And then Peter tells us in 1 Peter 2:13 and 14, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors set by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good." Now we're going to hit on one other part, right? Number 4, we have the church leadership, right? And church leadership is in place to protect the truth of God's word in the souls of those in the body. That doesn't always hit everybody well, right? So in our Western way of individualistic thinking, and we have a church hopping, consumeristic mentality of a lot of folks, it can be a foreign concept, right? It's difficult enough for us men to submit to real authority, whatever that might be, right? Let alone what we may view as the talking head on the stage. or maybe a group of men that, we didn't control who was elected as the elders or who was chosen as the leaders, the deacons of the church. So often it's just easier just to leave, right? Go somewhere else where our egos might be soothed, where maybe we can live in sin and not be called out, maybe be apostate and not be called out, maybe be, rub up against the word of God and not be called out. And here's where I'm going to give it an unsolicited plug. This was not requested by me or for me, to me. I'm going to give it an unsolicited plug for church membership. And then also growing where you're planted, right? If God has placed you in a local church, in this local church, whatever local church you're in, commit to it. Become a member. Seek the covering of one shepherd, right? The pastor who's in charge. I mean, there's spiritual blessing there, right? So seek that covering. And with that, submit to the leadership, right? In matters of truth. We could talk more about that, and you know what? I think we probably will, right? This is a kind of a topic that's perhaps fallen out of favor, but we'll talk about it more later. But let's hear what Paul says about it, right? He says, this is about overseers and their function, and then at the end, what people must do, right? So for an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who can contradict it, right? So that's where the discipline comes, right? If you're against sound doctrine, then you need to be rebuked, right? And then last we have men, right? And that's our job, right? That's where we'll spend the rest of our time tonight. And there are four components of protection, right? There's spiritual protection, physical protection, emotional protection, and mental protection. And they all kind of intertwine, right? So it's not like you can go, hey, I'm a physical protector. The rest of your emotional and mental, I don't care about. They all intertwine, right? Or they should, right? And really, if you think about mental and emotional, they're really almost inseparable. And as men, if you look at all through the Bible, that's what we're called to do, right? That's our design. We're designed to be protectors in all of those aspects. But of course, we're human. At least I am. You might be a robot or something else, but we're going to fail, right? We're going to fail in some of those. I know I have. I could probably fill up a page and a half, but we won't go there. But to illustrate that piece of it, the protection piece, and how you can live your life and go through that. We're gonna walk through the life of Lot, right? You may not have studied Lot a whole lot. That wasn't supposed to be necessarily humorous, but you may not have studied it much. So here's our chance, right? We're going to talk about Abraham a little bit, but more as the contrast. But also still to point out, we're all from the same family line, right? If you go, the period of Lot and Abraham wasn't much past the flood. So if you look at chronologically, it's pretty close time, right? So if you remember, I opened the message tonight from a passage from Genesis 14, and it's really a man's story, right? It's protecting your family. I take 318 men, and I go fight some folks, and I pull everybody back. That's a man's man, right? But let's start at the beginning so we can kind of fill in the backstory. So Abraham, who at the time was Abram, which means exalted father, this was before he was really called by God. He lived in a place called Ur, right? It's near the Persian Gulf. His father led the family, including Lot, who was Abram's nephew to Haran. They led him to Haran, which is near Turkey, right? And there Abram's father died. And so now Abram is the patriarch of the whole clan. And so it was there in Haran where God actually called Abraham, spoke to him and said, I will make you a great nation. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed by you. That's pretty heady stuff for a guy, young guy of 75. just in his peak of his prime, right? So anyways, God told him, he said, hey, head to Canaan because I'm going to give you all the land that your feet will trod. So off they went, the entire clan. And just so you kind of understand, because probably most of you haven't been to the Middle East. I know maybe one guy in the back who has been. So from Ur to Haran is about maybe 400 or 500 miles. It's a pretty good distance, right? And from Haran to Canaan is probably another 400 miles. So that's a good long ways to be trekking with, no cars, no highways, none of that stuff, right? It's sheep, goats, camels, oxen, and a bunch of folk walking for 1,000 miles. So that's a pretty good long piece, right? We don't have any examples in the Bible about this time period, but we got to kind of assume that Abram was protecting his folks. Because there's not a thing that says, and during the trip, Abram was assaulted by Bedouin raiders. No. So we have to kind of assume he gets there and he's protected his whole clan. It's an extended family. It's not like nowadays where we got, my two and, my kids and no more. It's brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces and a whole extended family, right? So here's Abram protecting his family, protecting his people. I can't find any fault in what he did, right? Took in his dead brother's son. Haran died at some point in his life. Lot is an orphan. He's taken in. No issues there, right? All right. Make sure they got all they need. So far, so good. So let's go a little further with Abram because I think Abram's kind of the place where we should start with. A severe famine comes on the land around Shechem and Bethel, and Abram goes, let's go to Egypt. I hear they got I can take my sheep down there. They can eat. So they start going to Egypt. And here's where Abram first abdicates his responsibility. His wife, she's a young 60-ish or so. She's a beautiful woman. Not like what we would consider today, but apparently a beautiful woman because they're worried. Abram goes, hey, I think the Egyptians might kill me and take my wife. But what we really will see is he doesn't really care what happens to his wife. He's more worried about what happens to him. Because here's what he says. He says, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman, beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, which she was. She was his sister. His half-sister. It was his father's other wife's daughter. So say that you're my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. So he doesn't care what happens to her. Hey, go wherever they take you, but let me live. So let me just say, that's not the way to protect your family. Now, fortunately for Sarai and Abram, God had other plans, right? So he intervenes. Sarai's returned to Abram, and they're ushered out of Egypt with gifts of donkeys, sheep, oxen, servants, which, just so you know, is the dowry that the Pharaoh had given to Abram so he could marry his sister. So Abram, who's like, tell him you're my sister. Oh, I get all this stuff. Let's leave. So not a good place to be, right? But that's just the beginning of the story. So we've already seen a really good example of protecting others, and then we quickly follow up with an abject failure. So if you're like me, don't be dismayed if you've not always met the mark. We've all been there. Abram was there. He's the father of all of us, right? All right, so let's look at Lot. So now Lot grew up in the church. He had the patriarch Abram. He had Abram's father. All of these things that were teaching them their ways. But in my opinion, Lot was kind of always the guy on the edge. He was kind of the guy who was, how far can I push the envelope? Maybe a PK, a preacher's kid, right? Living on his parents' righteousness, living on his name and his position, his place, maybe. All right, so they come out of Egypt, Abram and the family. They go back to Shechem, Bethel, and at this point, they're wealthy. Obscenely wealthy by any standard. They're so wealthy they don't have, there's not enough land for them to graze their sheep. So, I mean, Lot's herdsmen are, they're conflicting with Abram's herdsmen. And Abram, he tells Lot, he says, hey, look, we're family. Let's not fight. There's plenty of land in this country. You pick the portion that you want, and I'll take the rest. So Lot, of course, chose for himself what looked to be the best land. And he left the rest to Abram. He says, I'll take this piece. You can have whatever's left. And I will say the land that Lot chose, I mean, it was good land. It was likened to the garden of the Lord and the land of Egypt, which was good, right? But, as you might know, Sodom and Gomorrah, they were in the valley, right? And Lot, for whatever his background was drawn to the city. So he ends up moving to the city of Sodom. And I don't know, I mean, the Bible's not pretty specific. Did he sell everything off and live on the income? Or did he keep the herdsmen out in the fields where he's living the life of leisure? It doesn't really say. And it really doesn't matter, right? What's important to me, at least, is this. Once Lot left the protection of Abram, he made a series of poor choices. Now you got to ask yourself, I mean, we've already seen Abram. I mean, hey, sister, tell him you're my sister, right? Did he learn that? Was it modeled to him? Or was it because he dwelt among, as Genesis 13:13 would put it, the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord? I kind of tend to believe the latter, right? I mean, well, Abram, we've seen he made poor choices, and he made them again and again. I mean, there are lots of poor choices that Abram made. Another time he offered his wife up as his sister. He let his wife talk him into sleeping with his servant. He let his wife kick the servant out because he was like, yeah, you do with her what you want. So a lot of times Abram abdicated his protective piece. But I think overall you'll see that he's a pretty good model of faithfulness and devotion to both God and his family. I mean, he's the patriarch. He's why we're all here. If it weren't for Abraham, none of it, I mean, God would have worked it out another way, but obviously Abraham was the way that the country of Israel, the nation of Israel was going to be founded, and Christ was going to come to us. So obviously he was a pretty good model, right? So let's go back to where we begin. So Lot's living in Sodom. He's taken captive when war breaks out. So back then all these cities were like city states. They all had their own king. So it'd be like a king of Bellingham, a king of Linden, king of Ferndale, right? And so they're all in their own little kingdom, and a war breaks out between 9 kings in and around the valley. There was 4 kings outside the valley that kind of ruled everything. They said, hey, you can be a king, but you give me some money and you're okay. So they take him captive. These 5 kings come in and they run over these 4 kings, and they take everything. I mean, they take the whole city of Sodom. They take everything out of it. They take him captive. And that's where we started at the scripture, right? So Abram gathers his 318 men, and he goes and defeats 5 kings with 318 people. I think that's pretty impressive. I don't know how big these city kingdoms were, but you got 318 guys and you defeat 5 of them. That's pretty impressive, right? Certainly, in my opinion, the apex of protecting others in all 4 manners: physically, spiritually, because you brought them back into the family of God, mentally and emotionally. But let's get back to Lot, right? That's why we're here. You didn't come to hear about Abraham. You can hear about him any day, but you don't get to hear about Lot a lot. So we've talked a little bit about my view of Lot, and I could be wrong. I've read a lot of commentaries. We'll talk about Lot's righteousness later, but I see him as a kid who's living on his parents' salvation, his parents' righteousness, his parents' name, right? It's somebody who's been given every advantage, every opportunity, but never really developed the character, and in this case, the relationship with God to really walk in that advantage, right? In today's vernacular, we'd probably call him a casual or cultural Christian, right? And we see with Lot, he becomes very wealthy, very successful in the orbit, right? Living in the orbit of Abraham. Right? But when given the choice, how do you continue that success and build on that wealth and success? He starts to gravitate towards poor choices, right? He never had to leave the orbit of Abram. He just chose to, right? And how does that impact the folks that rely on him for protection? I mean, we really don't know what happened to the herdsmen because we don't really know what happened to the herds, right? Did he sell them all off or did he keep them? But we know his family, which is really the important piece. I mean, they're reasonably unprotected, right? He's chosen to make his home in Sodom, the home of the wicked, great sinners towards the Lord. So his family, now every day that's impacting his family. I mean, I don't care what you do. I mean, you can't cloister your family in a city. Every day they're impacted by that, right? And we'll see in a moment that Lot was kind of a man of some importance in Sodom. So it wasn't like he was just there. I read some commentators that talked about, well, Lot went there to evangelize. I can't find that when I read the Bible, and I can't find it when I read what I think are reasonable commentaries, right? He became a man of importance there, right? And then because he's in the city as opposed to living out in the wilderness, he's taken captive when the enemy takes the city. And that removes any protection, in my opinion. I mean, I don't know. I obviously wasn't alive in those days, but most captors can be pretty brutal. I mean, I've read enough historical fiction and historical things from the 400s until the 20th century, but captors, they take what they want. I mean, think about this is probably 400 BC. So we know in those days, captors, when they captured you, you became either a slave, or if you were a woman of the right age, you became a plaything for the men who captured you, right? So we don't know what happened, right? We know Lot had a wife and 2 daughters. I mean, what do you think happened to them? I mean, later in Genesis, it tells us that, he tells some folks that his daughters are virgins, never slept with a man. I have to believe him, but I mean, who knows? I mean, what happened to his family when they got captured, right? So anyways, they're restored. Abram comes to the rescue, restores them. All Lot's property is restored to him. So what's your next move? I mean, if I'm Lot, I'm thinking, that dude just saved my butt. I'm going to go hang out with him. Nope. Right back to Sodom. And that's where we're going to find him, right? In the next piece, right? 2 angels come to the city. They've met with Abram. They've had supper with Abram. They've told him that in a year they're going to come back. The Lord's going to come back and Sarah's going to be pregnant. And Abram kind of talks to him about, hey, what are you going to do? Kind of cajoles him. Hey, would you tear the cities down for 50, 40, 20, 10? For 10 righteous folks, would you destroy the cities? And they relent and say, yeah, for 10, if we find 10 folks, we'll let it live, right? So these 2 angels of the Lord come into town to see if the uproar against the city is deserved and to decide if they should destroy it, right? And this is the only time in the entire history of Lot that I can find that he ever protected anybody, right? So he's got at least some moral compass, which I got to believe he knows at some point in his life he knew God. So he's got a moral compass, right? He knew the men of Sodom were wicked. So Genesis 19 begins this way. It says, the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening and Lot was sitting at the gate. Well, if you know anything about that culture and that time, if you were sitting at the gate, you were a man of influence because that's where the men of influence sat. That's where people came to be judged or they came to air their grievances. So if you were at the gate, you were a man of influence. And that's where Lot was, right? But when Lot saw him, he rose to meet them and he bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, my lords, please turn aside to your servant's house, spend the night, wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. And they said, nope, we're going to spend the night in the town square. But he pressed them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread and they ate. So, I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, because he knows what's going to happen if they're in the town square. Soon after, the town's in an uproar. We're told that all of the men of Sodom were at Lot's door, banging on the door, demanding that two visitors be given to them so that they may know them, right? And in that, I won't necessarily tell you what that means, but I think you can kind of figure out. They want to know these two men. So all the men in Sodom want to know them, right? So in Lot's defense, he says, no, nope. In fact, at this point, he's more protective of them than his own family, because he goes out and he says, look, these two men are under my protection. I've given them safety in my home. Here, I have two daughters. Take them. So he's going to give away his daughters over two other folks, right? So he's protective of other folks, but not of his family, right? So the men get mad. They want to take Lot and do the same with him as they want to do with the two angels. The angels reach out, pull Lot in the house, and they blind the mob. And they tell Lot, look, you've got to go. Take you and all your family and leave and flee the city, because we're going to destroy it. And here we see Lot had such little influence with his family that there were two men that were engaged to his daughters. Dowry's already paid. I mean, they're already called his son-in-laws. And they're like, dude, we're not leaving with you. You're a freaking nut. And so he goes back and they won't go, right? And so in the morning, the angel's like, look, you got to go. We're going to destroy the city and the valley. And he's like, well, he's dragging his feet. He's been told, we're going to destroy this place. So the angels have to physically remove him and his family from the city to get him to go, because he's so drawn to the city, right? And in fact, he bargains with them, because they say, look, run to the hills, get to the hills. We can't destroy the city until you're out of danger. Get to the hills. He's like, oh, I can't make it that far. How about I go to the city over here? Is that okay? And they say, look, okay, that's fine. Get to the city. Don't look back. Go. As soon as you get there, we're going to destroy the place. So they leave. They flee. Homeless, penniless, alone. They flee. But again, Lot has so failed his family and leadership that his wife looks back, longing for the city. And as you know, she's turned into a pillar of salt, right? So Lot and his daughter finally get to the city. The Sodom and Gomorrah, the whole valley is destroyed. Then he gets scared. What happens if these men know that I was in Sodom and it's because of me that the city was destroyed? So what's he do? Perfect time to go back to Abram. Abram's just over the hills. Nope. He goes with his daughters to live in caves. They're going to dwell in caves, him and his daughters. And here we get to see the final culmination of Lot's final and continued failure to lead his family well and protect them. His daughters decide, hey, we're up here in the hills. Dad's not letting us out anywhere. There's no way we're going to meet any men and continue our family line. Let's get Dad drunk and sleep with him. So they do. First, the oldest one, and then the youngest one. And they both wind up pregnant. And who do they give birth to? What ends up being the two of the biggest enemies of Israel down the line, right? The Moabites and the Ammonites. So God's, refusing to follow God's word. I mean, here we go, right? So after this, I mean, we never hear of Lot again. I mean, there's a couple places in the New Testament where they bring him up. We'll talk about that, right? But I'm going to tell you, nothing in the Bible is by chance. We know that God isn't afraid to show the character flaws of his people. We've seen the disciples' character flaws, Abraham's, all the patriarchs, King David, who was the man after God's own heart, King Solomon, the wisest man ever lived. So why does Genesis devote part or all of 6 chapters to Lot? I guess I really don't know. But here's what I come up with, right, through my prayer and study and whatnot. I've covered some of it already, but when you compare and contrast Lot with Abram, we find that Abram trusted God, right? We don't really know what Lot trusted in other than his own cunning and wile. We talked about when Abraham and Lot split up, Lot used his physical eyes to pick where he wanted to settle. right? He was enticed by the grass and the river and the cities and the water, while Abram used the eyes of his heart, right? His spiritual eyes, and he chose where God told him to go. All right, we're going to start landing the plane. I'm really over time at this point. Sorry. We're going to recap 6 things that Lot missed that maybe will help you in your life, right? And I'll give you some good news at the end, right? So we just talked about this, right? Lot walked by sight, not by faith, right? And the true hallmark for any believer is that you walk by faith, right? What has God told you, right? But the worldly believer is going to reverse that order. What do I see? I see this, so therefore I fear this, or I see this, therefore I trust this, right? Secondly, Lot made his home and reared his children in wicked Sodom. I mean, and he chose to, right? It wasn't like it was, it's the only place I can go. He chose to go to Sodom, right? He's a prosperous citizen, holds a high position. He called the wicked men friends, right, when they came to the door. Friends, these men are my guests, right? So he probably never intended to drift into that world. Probably never intended to be God dishonoring. But as a Christian, how many of us get there, right? We never intend to be dishonoring. I know I have. I've dishonored God, and never intentionally. It's like, ooh, we kind of get there, right? But his wife, his children were so imbued with the worldliness that, as we see leading up to the end, that they couldn't make the right choices, right? Lot was out of touch with God. Number 3, right? He lost the consciousness of the presence of God. He didn't know how to seek God, where Abram, when he would go to a new place, he would set up an altar to the Lord and would call on the name of the Lord, right? He lost the experience of God, right? We're told in 2 Peter that the wickedness of the Sodomites distressed the soul of Lot, right? So his conscience was troubled and it stung him. So how can you know if you're living in wickedness and all that? Certainly you can't have peace in God, right? If he ever had it, he lost the power of God, right? He never witnessed, that we can tell, and never tried to bring the Sodomites to God. He just he melded into the culture instead of standing against the culture. He had no influence, right? He didn't look, walk, or act like a man of God. If he would have, you would think that the men of Sodom would not have so eagerly gone to his door and demanded that he cast out the men to be known by them, right? He had no influence with his children. If you had influence with your children, do you think that your daughters would decide that it's okay to get you drunk and sleep with you? Probably not. No influence with his own wife. She was so long in the city that he told her, don't look back. She was in the room with the angels, don't look back. But she wants the city so bad, she's willing to look back. Number 5, he went from bad to worse, became hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And I'll tell you, I've been in a spot where my life has gone from bad to worse, because once you start sinning habitually, it's easy to go there, right? So we know that Lot hesitated, right? Which, when he was told to leave, which means he was seared, right? His conscience was seared. He wasn't really willing to call sin, right? He was slow to obey. And then lastly, Lot lost his honor and was involved in shame with his daughter. So we won't go through that, but certainly a place where, I can't imagine. I have one daughter. I can't imagine her ever stooping to the point where she thinks, I have to sleep with my dad to make my family line continue, right? Well, here's the good news, right? So if you read 2 Peter again, right, Lot was literally saved, right? He had righteousness imbued to him, not by anything that Abram did, although, there are some things that would say that Abram prayed for Lot, right? So that was why Abram was bargaining with the angels about how many righteous people will you allow before you ruin the cities, right? But we know that at some point in Lot's life, he believed in the Lord, knew the Lord, So he was saved. So as by fire. So we're all told we're going to be judged at the end, and all believers will be saved, but we'll be judged by our works. We'll be judged by the things we did. And we may be saved as by fire, which, man, I don't want to be saved as by fire. I want to be saved, and I want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. Right? Okay, so we're really close to landing. The flaps are down, the wheels are down. You aviation folks tell me I'm all screwed up. So we can learn a lot, we can model a lot by watching folks, right? And I'm sure most of our dads, regardless of their beliefs, set us up with kind of a baseline protection scheme. Just like Lot, right? He had that baseline protection. I mean, I don't know how old he was. It never says. But I mean, Abram was 75. His dad was younger than Abram. So let's say he was 70. He probably had a kid at 30. So Lot's probably 40. He's got daughters old enough to sleep with him. So Lot's not a young man, right? So he had a lot of his life growing up learning the right things, right? But where do we land when the pressure comes, right? When the city beckons, when we're surrounded by the wicked great sinners against the Lord? Do we keep ourselves and our families safe? Or do we stay there, right? And these are pretty good things to think about and decide now, right? Before you need to exercise the choice. Do you know how you're going to proceed if you're not a dad, you're not a father, you'll get there, right? But how are you going to proceed when your kids are tempted to run with the wrong crowd? Are you pouring into the folks in your circle of protection? And do you have the right view to be able to protect them physically, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally? Are you like Abraham, who ended up becoming the father of a multitude? Or are you like Lot, which means veiled or darkened, right? And I'm going to close with a quote from someone I never thought I would quote. Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? He's a black activist, anti-Israel. He's probably an anti-Semite. But this quote I thought was of enough importance that I'm going to use it. So typically I wouldn't quote him. So don't take this guy as the gospel for the gospel. Right? But he says, I've been with my spouse for almost 15 years. In those years, I've never been with anyone but the mother of my son. But that's not because I'm an especially good and true person. In fact, I'm wholly in possession of an unimaginably filthy and mongrel mind. But I'm also a dude who believes in guardrails. As a buddy of mine once put it, I don't believe in getting in the moment and then exercising willpower. I believe in avoiding the moment. I believe in being absolutely clear with myself about why I'm having a second drink and why I'm not. Why I'm going to a party and why I'm not. I believe the battle is lost at happy hour, not at the hotel. I am not a good man, but I'm prepared to be an honorable one. So I'm not saying that Christians can't be good protectors, right? But they're not going to be protectors in the spiritual sense. So that's what we got to get to, right? You got to understand, where are you at? What are you going to do? How are you going to live? And it all comes from before you get there. So that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about the things that God would have us talk about. Because that's where the rubber hits the road. You can't decide with your trousers down around your knees and the naked lady on the bed, this isn't a good time. Right? You got to decide long before then that I'm never going to get in a spot where my trousers are around my knees and there's a naked lady on the bed, unless that naked lady's your wife. Okay?